Hi everyone, this is Matt. Welcome back to my channel. So today I want to talk to you about the introduction part of your PhD Viva. So what do you need to remember? How much do you need to know? And what are the expectations of your examiners? So let's dive in. So first of all, everyone is super stressed about the introduction part of your PhD Viva because you know, how much do you need to remember? You cited hundreds of papers in your PhD thesis, and now we're going to ask you questions about them. And this is actually the first step. Ideally, you are still writing a PhD thesis, and you should really keep it as slim as possible, at least the introduction part. And you should only talk about the papers that are relevant to your PhD title, to your research title. Because remember, whatever you cite is fair game for the examiners to ask you about. So don't cite research reviews, okay? Because reviews are so broad, they cover so many things, you may not be familiar with everything they talk about. And if you cite a review, then there you go, they can ask you about it. Now, if you write a nice but very broad and lengthy introduction, they will ask you questions about everything because they have to cover everything you wrote about to check whether you're an expert. But what if you're not an expert in something? You're expert in your own sliver of research of the field, but you might talk about other things that are kind of related, but you're not that familiar with them, and then they will ask you questions and they will grill you and you'll get stressed. So don't do that. Only write about the things that you're very familiar with. So my PhD thesis introduction was only 23 pages, and that was actually enough, absolutely enough. I have a couple of friends who wrote PhD thesis introductions that were like 60, 70 pages long, and oh my god, they got so grilled. I got grilled as well. And that's another thing that is important to understand. Expect to get grilled, and expect your examiners to expect that you will not know answers to all of your questions. That's so key. They really don't think you will be able to answer all of their questions, especially when it comes to introduction. And you also need to assume that it's okay to not know all of the answers. So as we ask you questions, you will not know some of the answers and you just need to move on. But it's difficult to say because it's such a stressful situation. I remember when they were asking me, I got stressed. Well, luckily for me, my PhD thesis introduction was only 23 pages. So we moved through it quite quickly. And the moment we got to results, then I gained my confidence again because I knew exactly what we were talking about. My introduction was difficult and you need to expect it, but it's okay if you don't know everything. So now the questions we're going to ask you about are going to be about key concepts and key ideas. So it's not going to be like, oh, this guy Matt Jurga wrote in his paper on page number 5, table number 6, this and that. What did he write about? What were the conclusions? No, it's not gonna be like that. It's gonna be a conversation about ideas. We're not gonna ask you specifically about papers. We're gonna ask you about proteins. For example, I'm a biologist. They ask me about certain proteins, certain ideas, pathways, the big things, okay, the key concepts, the key bullet points. So when I was preparing for my PhD my PhD Viva, I was actually writing mind maps on the empty pages of my PhD thesis. And then I took this PhD thesis with me for my PhD Viva. So when I opened my PhD thesis, I had all of these mind maps in front of me with all the pathways, with all the diseases, proteins interconnected in front of me. And that was enough, to support me, but they were okay with that. They didn't have any problems with me having some notes. After all, I brought my PhD thesis. Everything is already there. I just extracted this information into format that was easily digestible, and I can look at it and I would really quickly know what's going on. So I would definitely recommend to you drawing some mind maps and then bringing them to your PhD Viva. They will become really useful during the introduction part. So as you're reading the papers, as you're preparing for your PhD Viva, actually just read your thesis itself. Okay? Prepare some mind maps and just think about it. Think how everything interconnects. Because this is what these guys want to talk about. The concepts, the ideas, the future experiments, the trends, the patterns, the research gaps. This is what is important to them. They will only ask you a bit more specific questions if they see mistakes in your introduction. But it's very, very unlikely that they will see any mistakes in your introduction, because after all, you've got it from other people, from other papers. So if there is something wrong in your introduction, that is because it was wrong in a paper. So you can always defend yourself by saying that, well, I quoted someone and I will double check, but it looks like something they said here wasn't correct. So and that's absolutely fine. So don't worry about the nitty gritty details about the papers. Even if when you read methods papers, you again don't need to remember the exact details of how they did these experiments, what they suggested. So for example, instead of saying that, oh, they used 150 millimolar of this solution and half a molar of that solution, you don't need to say any of that. You can just say this, well, I think they used some detergent, they used some antibodies, some beads, and that was it. I don't remember exactly the details, but I remember it came from, you know, this paper, I think that was the main offer, and that's okay, that's enough. And and if you really want to go above and beyond, you can actually talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these methods. You can talk about advantages and disadvantages of any paper as well. Because what we're really after is that meta conversation, is that holistic view on all of the literature and understanding how it interconnects and what are the big conclusions, what are the big steps for our future. Because this is what these guys, examiners, are thinking about. Remember, they're thinking about writing grants, they're thinking about doing research in the future. And they don't want to they don't want to get another grant for some nitty gritty detail of how a specific protein works, but it's not particularly relevant to the majority of people or to anyone really. They want to look at the bigger picture. So for example, for us it was always about cancer and neurodegeneration. For my colleagues who used to work on plants, it was always about food security. Okay, so we're not that interested how this single plant is working. We are interested to learn details from this plant that will help us secure food in the future. So you see, it is always about the big picture. This is what you need to remember, and just create some mind maps. And as you read papers, also just write, a few bullet points, a couple of bullet points with key information from each paper. That is enough information that you need. And then if you're using a software reference manager like Mendeley or Zotero, then have all of these papers there and make catalogs, make folders, subfolders to organize these papers by themes. So for example, I was working on RNA-DNA hybrids. How do they cause neurodegeneration? How do they cause cancer? How do they cause aging? Whatever. Da 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 da. And I would just have these subfolders. This is how they do it in mice. This is how they do it in animals. This is how they do it in humans, and so on. So have everything divided so it's easily accessible. And then as you click on each paper, just get a couple of bullet points. And in this way, instead of having, you know, hundreds and hundreds of papers with millions of data points and information, you have them all cataloged. And you can look immediately at the key information. What is key to you? What is key to your paper? Because remember, this is what they will ask about. They will ask questions about this literature in reference to your research. They will look for how is this information relevant to your research. So remember that, always have that connection. They might also ask you questions about introduction that is relevant to their own research, but this is not what you want to do. You don't want to talk too much about anything that is not relevant, directly relevant to your thesis. So I hope you're still writing. Make sure that your introduction is really on point, really deals with only anything that is relevant to your research topic, and just memorize a couple of points per paper. And really, don't expect that these guys will want you to answer perfectly every single question and remember perfectly every single paper, because they don't. And they don't really expect you to remember all of this information either. And I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. And I remember finding my PhD thesis so stressful. Well, I remember thinking of it and thinking, oh, it's going to be so stressful. And I really didn't want to do it. But then it happened. And I actually really enjoyed the whole process. And to be honest, the only part that I found stressful was the introduction, when they were asking me about the introduction. But it was only for a couple of minutes when they asked me, they asked me so many questions, but I knew answers to most of them. So when they asked me something that I wasn't sure about, when this is when I felt, a little bit anxious. But really now looking at it, 5 years later, it really wasn't a big deal. After I became a supervisor, I had my own PhD student. That wasn't a really big deal. You really don't need to remember everything. You just need to understand the big picture, how everything falls together, and what we should do with this research in the future. And that's it. You will be absolutely fine. Enjoy your PhD Viva. Have this nice conversation about your research and about future research with these guys. Because after all, you know, I like to think of myself as a nerd and of PIs as nerds as well. So if you identify as a nerd like I do, then it's just a conversation with other nerds and it's absolutely fine. It's just geeking out together. That's all it is. So I'm sure you'll be fine. And if you benefit from this content, please subscribe and I will see you in the next video.